September 25th, 1957. Little Rock, Arkansas. 9 black teenagers stood at the gates of Little Rock Central High School. Facing them, soldiers, mobs, and hatred so loud it shook the air. They weren't warriors. They were students, 15, 16, 17 years old. But their walk into that building forced America to look at itself, and it didn't like what it saw. This wasn't just about a school. It was about a nation finally being forced to answer a question it had been avoiding for centuries. What happens when black Americans demand equality, not in theory, but in reality? For over a decade, black Americans didn't ask for equality. They demanded it. They organized for it. They bled for it. And in demanding it, they didn't just change laws. They changed the soul of a nation that fought them every step of the way. After World War II, America called itself the land of the free. But for millions of black Americans, that freedom stopped at the edge of their neighborhood. They could fight for their country overseas, but they couldn't buy a home where they chose. They could build the nation's wealth, but not share in it. The contradiction was everywhere. Water fountains, restaurants, schools, buses. Every part of daily life was a reminder. You are not equal here. According to GI Bill data from the 1940s, less than 2% of black veterans in Mississippi received housing or education benefits. A law written for everyone, applied to almost no one. Black families earned half what white families earned. Black children attended schools with a fraction of the funding. Black voters faced literacy tests designed to be impossible. All of this happened under a constitution that promised equal protection under law. The promise was written. The reality was a lie, and for decades, black Americans endured. They worked within the system. They petitioned. They voted when they could. They waited for justice, until they stopped waiting. The spark. August 28, 1955. 14-year-old Emmett Till was visiting family in Mississippi. 3 days later, he was murdered for allegedly whistling at a white woman. His killers beat him beyond recognition, shot him, and threw his body in a river with a cotton gin fan tied around his neck. When Emmett Till's mother insisted on an open casket, she wasn't just mourning. She was testifying. I wanted the world to see what they did to my boy. That image lit a fire across the country. You couldn't look away. You couldn't pretend anymore. And a few months later, in Montgomery, that fire became a movement. Rosa Parks wasn't just tired that day. She was an organizer, a trained activist. And when she refused to give up her seat, she knew exactly what she was doing. Within hours, E.D. Nixon was on the phone. Within days, Black Montgomery was organizing a bus boycott. And a 26-year-old minister named Martin Luther King Jr. found himself leading something that would change the world. For 381 days, black residents of Montgomery refused to ride the buses. They walked. They organized carpools. They sacrificed. And they won. Not because they asked nicely, because they made the system impossible to ignore. This was the spark. And once it caught, there was no putting it out. Organization and strategy. These weren't random protests. This was warfare. Strategic, disciplined, calculated. The Southern Christian Leadership Conference coordinated across states. SNCC organized students. CORE planned direct action. The NAACP fought in the courts. Every march, every sit-in was calculated. Activists studied the law, trained volunteers in nonviolence, and used the cameras as their armor. They practiced being spit on, being insulted, being hit, and not hitting back. Because they knew America wouldn't change out of conscience. It would change when the world was watching. February 1st, 1960. 4 college students sat down at a Woolworth's lunch counter in Greensboro, North Carolina. They were refused service. They didn't leave. They sat there in silence until closing. Within 2 months, sit-ins spread to 54 cities in 9 states. Thousands of students, sitting in silence, demanding to be served. Then came the Freedom Rides. Black and white activists rode interstate buses into the Deep South, testing the Supreme Court's ban on segregated transportation. They were beaten, firebombed, some nearly killed. But they kept riding, because every act of violence was proof that segregation couldn't survive scrutiny. Meanwhile, in Mississippi, organizers were doing the most dangerous work of all, registering black voters. Bob Moses, Fannie Lou Hamer. Names you might not know, but their courage built the foundation. In 1960, less than 5% of eligible black voters in Mississippi were registered. Poll taxes, literacy tests, and terror kept them away. In the summer of 1964, over 1,000 volunteers poured into Mississippi. They opened freedom schools. They registered voters. They built a parallel democracy. James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Schwerner were murdered that summer by the Klan, working with local police. Their bodies were found buried in an earthen dam. But the movement didn't stop, because this was never about individual safety. This was about collective liberation. They learned from failure, too. The Albany campaign in 1962 failed because the police chief was smart. He arrested protesters without visible brutality. No cameras, no outrage, no national pressure. So in Birmingham, they chose differently. They picked Bull Connor, a commissioner known for violence. They knew he'd react, and they used that reaction to expose the system. The breaking point. Birmingham, 1963, the most segregated city in America, and the place where the movement would force the nation to choose sides. On May 2nd, over 1,000 black children walked out of school and marched downtown. The youngest was 8 years old. Bull Connor ordered the attack. Fire hoses, police dogs, batons. America watched as children were hosed down, dogs unleashed, men and women beaten for walking in the street. These weren't rioters. They were citizens asking for the same rights written into the Constitution. And for the first time, the hypocrisy was undeniable. While locked in a Birmingham jail, King wrote a letter, not to segregationists, but to white moderates who told him to wait, to be patient, to go slow. He wrote, "We know through painful experience that freedom is never voluntarily given by the oppressor. It must be demanded by the oppressed." Patience wasn't virtue. It was complicity. 4 months later, on August 28, 1963, over 250,000 people gathered in Washington, D.C. This wasn't just black Americans. This was labor unions, religious leaders, students, white and black, side by side, demanding change. And then Martin Luther King Jr. gave a speech that would define a generation. "I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed." He wasn't making a wish. He was making a demand. But speeches don't change laws. Pressure does. And in Selma, Alabama, that pressure would reach its breaking point. March 7th, 1965. 600 marchers crossed the Edmund Pettus Bridge, heading toward Montgomery to demand voting rights. State troopers and a sheriff's posse were waiting. They gave the marchers 2 minutes to turn back. What happened next was broadcast into living rooms across America. Tear gas, billy clubs, horses trampling people. John Lewis, a 25-year-old organizer, had his skull fractured. He thought he was going to die. The nation erupted. Not just black America. White Americans in cities across the country took to the streets, because you can't watch that kind of violence and stay neutral. 8 days later, President Lyndon Johnson addressed Congress, and for the first time, a president said what activists had been demanding all along. "We shall overcome," he said. Borrowing the movement's own anthem, the demand had finally been heard. The system responds. But for every door opened, another was locked. Progress provoked retaliation, and the system wasn't going down without a fight. As marches filled the streets, the FBI filled files with names. J. Edgar Hoover called the civil rights movement the greatest threat to national security. Martin Luther King Jr. wasn't just followed. He was threatened. The FBI sent him anonymous letters trying to blackmail him into suicide. Malcolm X wasn't just opposed. He was silenced. Shot 21 times in a Harlem ballroom while his family watched. Medgar Evers was shot in his own driveway, in front of his home, for the crime of organizing voters. And while laws changed, white America found new ways to segregate. White flight emptied cities. Suburbs became the new color line. Banks drew red lines around black neighborhoods, refusing loans. The FHA subsidized white suburbs while denying black families the same opportunity. Schools integrated on paper. But in practice, white parents pulled their kids out, founding private academies, separate and unequal, just wore a different mask. April 4th, 1968. Martin Luther King Jr. stepped onto the balcony of the Lorraine Motel in Memphis. A single bullet ended his life. He was 39 years old. America burned that night. Over 100 cities erupted, not in celebration, but in rage and grief. The man who preached nonviolence had been murdered by violence. Equality was being demanded, but the system wasn't surrendering quietly. Every inch of progress was paid for, in blood. The transformation. The laws came, one by one. Hard-won victories written into the legal code. July 2nd, 1964. The Civil Rights Act banned segregation in public places and employment discrimination. August 6th, 1965. The Voting Rights Act banned literacy tests and put federal oversight on states with histories of discrimination. April 11th, 1968. Just 1 week after King's assassination, the Fair Housing Act banned discrimination in housing. The ink dried on the Civil Rights Act, but racism didn't. It adapted. It hid behind policies, neighborhoods, and budgets. The signs came down, but the system stayed standing. In 1968, the average black family had 1/7 the wealth of the average white family. Today, it's 1/8. The gap got wider, not narrower. Schools integrated briefly, then resegregated. By 2020, American schools were more segregated than they were in 1970. The war on drugs became the new Jim Crow. Black Americans incarcerated at 5 times the rate of white Americans for similar offenses. And the Voting Rights Act, gutted by the Supreme Court in 2013. States immediately passed new restrictions. The fight they thought they'd won had to be fought again. The movement changed laws. It opened doors. It proved that black Americans could force the nation to honor its promises. But it also proved something else, that systems of power don't fall. They evolve. The legacy. The civil rights movement didn't end. It evolved. When nonviolence met bullets, black power emerged. The Black Panthers. Self-defense. Economic independence. A different strategy for the same goal. Freedom. The marches may look different now. The signs are digital, the crowds global. But the fight, the demand to be seen, heard, and treated as equal, never ended. Every black person who votes without a literacy test, every child who attends an integrated school, every family that can't legally be denied a home because of their race. These aren't gifts, they're victories, won by people who refuse to accept anything less than equality. And most of those victories came from people whose names you'll never know. Ella Baker, who organized the organizers. Diane Nash, who planned the strategy. Bayard Rustin, who coordinated the March on Washington. Septima Clark, who ran citizenship schools. And thousands more whose names aren't in textbooks, but whose courage built the foundation. The people who hosted meetings in their homes, who drove carpools during the boycott, who registered voters knowing they might be killed for it. Today's fights echo yesterday's. Voting rights, police accountability, economic justice. The names and tactics change, but the demand remains the same. Equality. Not someday, now. Every modern movement for justice walks in the footsteps of those who faced fire hoses and refused to run. The baton has been passed. The race continues. We started with 9 teenagers walking into a school, facing hatred, facing violence, walking anyway. They walked so their children wouldn't have to, but their children are still walking, still fighting, still demanding. Because here's the truth they don't teach in textbooks. Equality wasn't America's gift to black people. It was a demand black people forced America to honor. Every inch of progress came from courage, not kindness, from sacrifice, not sympathy. from people who refused to accept less than freedom. They didn't ask for permission to be human. They didn't wait for approval to be free. They organized. They strategized. They marched. They bled. And that courage, the refusal to accept less than freedom, changed this nation forever.